This IABS webinar on COVID-19 will start soon. Thank you for joining.
Welcome everybody to this second IABS webinar on the state of the art on COVID-19. Like during our May 27 webinar, we welcome very warmly the 4 speakers who did an excellent job at that time. Today they will give us an overview, each in their domain, about what we learned since May. And I have the feeling we learned a lot. The 4 speakers will each talk 15 minutes, one after each other. You are invited to pose your questions using the Q&A button on your screen. Your questions will be posed by myself individually or in group to the speakers, and if we have an overflow of questions, we apologize if all questions cannot be answered. Now I give the floor to the first speaker, Professor Arnaud Fontanet from Institut Pasteur, who will talk us about the latest data epidemiologically on the pandemic. Professor Fontanet, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joris, and I'm very pleased to be here again and to have a chance to share with you some of the recent findings of studies we have performed, as well as discussing the epidemiological situation. As the title of my presentation shows, I will be focusing on Europe, but I believe many of the data I'm going to share with you will be also relevant for other countries, although we are at different phases of the epidemic, as you all know. So last time, I believe I shared that slide with you, which was a result of the work we had performed on mathematical modeling. The team of Simon Cauchemez at Institut Pasteur had been able to reconstruct the epidemic dynamics using data on hospitalization for COVID on the French territory. And they estimated, using mathematical modeling, that at the end of the lockdown period, which was mid-May for France, 5% of the population had been infected, with 10% for the 2 regions most hurt by the epidemic, which are the eastern part and the area around Paris, whereas the western part of the country was the least affected, Bretagne, and the rest of the country was in between, with an overall prevalence of the infection of around 5.3%, according to their estimates. The basic reproductive number had been estimated at 2.9, which means that for the virus to stop circulating spontaneously and creating epidemics, we would need to have at least 66% of the population infected before the virus would be circulating at the pace it is currently circulating. When
I'm sorry to interrupt, we don't see your slides.
I have to
Sorry.
send it again then, I guess. Let me try again. Does it work?
Yes.
Okay, sorry for that. So, well, you just see basically what I was describing to you, and a sort of a bit heterogeneous situation for France, which had to do with the initiation of the epidemic in the eastern part of France following an evangelical church meeting, and then the region of Paris, which had been very much affected probably by a cluster which started north of Paris and moved to the capital city. So again, I was mentioning that we need 2/3 of the French population to be immunized against the virus, whether it is through natural infection or vaccine, before the virus will start to be epidemic. One analysis we performed, which I'm sharing with you and has been published in the Lancet since, was trying to find out whether the lockdown had been efficient in France for stopping the virus circulation. And there had been another controversy, which was, why did we perform the lockdown at the national level, whereas it could have been sufficient to do it at the regional level in the eastern part of France and around Paris, since the epidemic was very active there, but not in the rest of the country. And you all understand that the lockdown had a major impact on the local economy. So what we did with Simon Cauchemez was to look at the hospital admission by region. And here you have the 13 regions of France. And the aim of this analysis was to show that first, it was truly the lockdown which stopped the epidemic wave. And two, each region was already in a dynamic that would have resulted in a major local epidemic had the lockdown not been performed. So to do this, we look at let's take this region, which is around Lyon. It is the second largest city of France in the middle eastern part of France. And what you see here is the epidemic curve of hospital admission. The scale here is number of hospital admissions per 100,000 inhabitants, and we use a threshold of 1 per 100,000 inhabitants for the hospitalization rate. If you convert that into number of cases every day on a daily basis, at the national level, that threshold would mean 150,000 infections. So you realize it means a lot of circulation of the virus. But at the beginning, before hospitalization, you don't see it. It's only number of new cases per day, but it really means the virus is already circulating a lot. And what you can see here on this slide, you have here the lockdown, which was 17th of March. And here you have the peak of hospital admission, which here is 28th of March. It's exactly 11 days after the lockdown. 11 days, it is a time between infection and hospitalization for those who do a severe form of infection. So in this region, it looks like indeed it is a lockdown that stopped the epidemic and dynamics, if you want, as it's exactly these 11 days that separate infection from hospital admission. The other interesting point is that you can see here that around March 15, 2 days before the lockdown, we already had reached a stage corresponding at national level, if we were using the same rate, to 150,000 new infections per day. So it's already extremely high. And therefore, here you can see that we had a very dynamic epidemic in this region of Lyon, and that the lockdown stopped it. And if you continue now throughout France, you will see that basically it's more or less 11 days after the lockdown that we had the peak, plus or minus 2 days for the hospital admissions. And you will also see that the threshold of 1 hospital admission per 100,000 inhabitants has been reached in all regions of France by the time of observation here, which means that when we compare the region where the dynamic has been the fastest, which was the eastern part, and this threshold had been reached on the 10th of March, and the region where the epidemic has been the slowest, which is Bretagne, western part of France, and the threshold has been reached on 23rd of March, all regions of France had an epidemic dynamic which would have resulted in a massive epidemic had the lockdown not been there. So that paper shows, one, it is a lockdown that has been efficient. Two, with a shift of 13 days, all regions of France were all going towards a major sanitary crisis. So lockdown has been efficient and was necessary everywhere, and not only in the two regions which were the most affected, like Grand Est and Île-de-France. Now, if we look at what happened in the rest of Europe, you will see that similar to what we estimated for France, for most countries, including Spain, for instance, which was one of the most affected countries, the proportion of people infected, and these are surveys based on antibody testing, show that 5% of the population had been infected. 10% if you go to cities like Geneva or Paris, for instance. But Sweden, end of April, was 7%. But basically, all Europe was about at the same level, with, for the countries most affected by the epidemic, like Spain, Italy, France, 5% of the general population infected, and countries, maybe the UK a bit higher and other countries a bit lower. And for France, the serological survey found exactly the same finding than the one I was sharing with you through mathematical modeling. So it's really interesting to see that both ended up with the same estimate. But again, for Europe, we are very far from this herd immunity that we would need for the virus to stop circulating spontaneously. Now, what happened during the summer? Here is what we call a heat map, where we compare 4 departments close to Paris. So Paris is the lower right, and here you have 3 departments around Paris. So the sort of suburban areas around Paris. On this heat map, you have here the age categories, starting from 0 to 9 years of age and going up 10, 19, up to more than 90 years of age. And here you have the time, starting from, it's by week, and this is a week 18-24 May, going through the summer to 5-11 of October. So here we have 5 months with the summer in the middle. And in the colors that you can see here, the redder you are, the higher the incidence rate by age groups. And when it starts to be red like here, it means that we are above the threshold of circulation of the virus that we consider becomes really significant. So you can see that May and June was basically green, and that in August, in the second week of August, in the 20-29 years of age, the incident rate started to become into the red area. And throughout the summer, up to October, you can see that the incidence rate started to increase in all age groups, reaching the older age group of the more than 70 here, or the younger age group, in a very similar way in the 4 departments. And I have exactly the same map, heat map for Marseille, south of France, and you would find exactly the same for other European cities or American cities. And it's really interesting because it shows you that the epidemic started in the young age group of 20-29 and gradually over a few weeks reached other age categories. And at that time, August in France, we had a rise in number of cases, but we did not have a rise in hospitalization because those young people did not make severe forms of disease. But by September and October, when the older age group were reached, then people started to go to the hospital. And that has been the topic of a lot of controversies in France. And I don't know to which extent it has been the same for other European countries, for instance, or elsewhere in the world. But there were people saying during the summer, the virus has mutated and you do have an increasing number of cases, but the disease is much less severe than what it was in last March. We won't have a second wave of hospitalization. And all that was going on. The month of September for us has been hell, because in the mathematical models that the team of Simon Kochmelz developed, it was very clear that it was the age of the people infected that was explaining why we did not have hospitalization. But all those people in the media attracted a lot of attention, and people were very happy to hear that the virus had changed and that the disease would no longer be as severe as before. So we had very, very hard time to make people realize that unfortunately, the virus was back. And here I show you the modeling effort that was performed by the team of Simon, where you can see here is intensive care unit to the left and hospital admissions to the right. And this is an exponential curve. So we have here exactly the same rate of an R at 1.4. So it's a 40% increase per week because the time serial interval is 1 week. 40% increase in week. You don't see it at hospital ICU or hospital admission when you are at very low level. But if you continue exactly the same dynamic, at a certain stage, which here is the month of October, you see that the hospital admission in intensive care unit and conventional hospital becomes really high. And here is the threshold of number of beds we have for Paris. Unfortunately, during the month of September, when we were saying it's coming back, if it continues at that rate, we will saturate our intensive care units. Nobody was here to listen because people were saying, look, there are no one in the hospital beds and the virus has mutated and it's all over. And fortunately, we woke up too late with measures that you have seen in France, but other European countries have become serious. And this is going to be my last slide. I'm showing you here the dynamic of number of cases for several European countries. And what we have seen in France and might have been true for other European countries was the first wave that you see here for France, where we had the people coming back from holidays, going to school, universities, getting back their jobs, and in the cities, quite some tension, but somewhat after 3 weeks, we had the feeling that it was stabilizing. And the week of the 5th of October has been of a very different nature, with a very sharp increase in number of cases that we have seen also in all other countries, maybe not Spain at that stage, but the other ones, you can see that it's rising very high. And something has happened during the week of 5th of October in all European countries and all regions of France simultaneously. Beyond that effect of coming back to school, universities, and jobs, I wonder, but I don't have any data to document it, to support it, whether this was not the second effect that we were anticipating. When it becomes colder, people stay at home, confined environment, higher survival of the virus in colder climate, and the second effect. So we had, as the Scientific Council always said, by September, October, be careful. There will be people coming back to work, school, universities, and that's probably what we had here. And then it will become colder, and maybe, but I don't have yet the data to support it, then things become even more tense. And France, as many other European countries, in the last 7 days have taken some measure. For us, it's called a curfew. The term is a bit extreme, but we are just closing places at 9 in the evening, and people are no longer allowed to get out of their place except for professional or emergency reasons. So this is my update for where we are now. I'm sorry that the news are not good. And I hope that my colleagues will have better things to tell you, maybe around the vaccines with Melanie, I don't know. But now we have to be ready for a tough winter. And I think we all have to be extremely careful and use all what we have learned to fight this virus, because we will need it for the coming month. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Fontanet.